The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Mark Blyth is a professor of international political economy at Brown University and a faculty fellow at Brown's Watson Institute for International Studies. A native of Scotland, he received his Ph.D. in political science from Columbia University and taught at the Johns Hopkins University as well. He is the author of a new book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Mark Blyth, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
A pleasure to be here. So,
how did the United States and Europe get into the financial crisis they're trying to work themselves out of?
There's a $64,000 question, as they used to say. Let's rephrase this, right? Why are we even calling it a kind of a financial crisis that the states are in? Because what actually happened, and everyone should remember this because it was such a huge event, was that the financial systems of all the advanced industrial countries blew up. And we made a decision, which I thought was a good idea at the time, but I've since backed off, that we needed to bail these guys because they were too big to fail. And when you do that, momentous things happen. One of them is that your tax revenues plummet. And half of the increase in debt since 2008 is down to the fact that tax revenues collapsed and you had to plug the gap. Your deficit balloons. And then on top of that, you have the cost of recapitalization and other such programs, and then TARP, stimulus, etc. So a large part of it goes off with basically cleaning up the mess of the financial crisis. But more significantly than that, this goes back further, and people forget about this. The U.S. fiscal state, the federal government, spends about 25% of GDP, but it taxes at 18%. So there's your deficit. You multiply that over a good few years, throw in a couple of wars of choice, add in some tax cuts that were never going to fund themselves, and then build the financial sector. No wonder there's a huge amount of debt around there. But the notion that this was an orgy of public spending, that's completely mythical. That's part of the huge political bait and switch, which unfortunately I think the Democrats have fallen victim to, even though it's very much a Republican idea.
A case of sleight of hand there then, huh?
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, many economists and political leaders argue that austerity is the only way out of the fiscal crisis. So if there is a case to be made for austerity, what is it, and why do you think it won't work in the United States or most of Europe?
All right. On its own, it's a very commonsensical idea. Basically, you're spending too much, you need to basically stop spending. But as I just pointed out, we didn't spend too much. What happened was we didn't raise enough revenue, and then we bailed out a financial sector. This is hardly, let's just decide to spend more money than we've got. Now, what's the case that could be made for austerity? On its own, any single state or firm or family, for that matter, can, if everyone else is still spending, reduce their spending, reduce their consumption, increase their savings, and then reduce their debt. But the problem is, if everyone tries this at the same time, if you have a kind of simultaneous contraction, particularly when interest rates are really low, then all that happens is you basically cannibalize your economy, and you end up with more debt rather than less. And that's exactly what we see in the Eurozone now. Every country that has undergone an austerity program since 2010 now has more debt rather than less. And the ones that cut the most are the ones that are the worst off. You can't all do this at once. It's a fallacy of composition. Everything that's true of the whole is not true of the parts.
So austerity creates the very conditions it's supposed to prevent.
That's exactly it. That's the great paradox. And you have to take that one extra logical step to see why that, in a sense, is inevitable. One way to think about this is imagine the economy as a fraction. Imagine like 4/5, right? So make 4 the debt and 5 the size of the economy. That'd be an 80% debt to GDP ratio. Now imagine the government says, we're going to cut half of all public spending, and that takes out 20% of the 5 on the bottom. You've now got 4/4. You've now got 100% debt to GDP. So the idea that you simply stop spending and the debt reduces itself actually isn't that simple. There's a very sort of deep fallacy of composition problem there.
Interesting, it's and refreshing that you can explain it so simply, and hopefully more people will begin to understand that. We're speaking with Mark Blyth, professor of international political economy at Brown University, also the author of a new book called Austerity: The History of a Dangerous Idea. Now, there's an economic parable you refer to in your book about Bill Gates walking into a bar. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Sure. If the first problem with austerity, as I've been saying, is this kind of fallacy of composition problem, we can't all cut at once and expect to grow. The second one is the distributional effects. It just isn't fair. Now, the Bill Gates parable goes like this. Imagine you got a standard bar with standard people in it, and you add up their average wealth. Then basically you got a bunch of people on a few $1,000s a month. In comes Bill. Bill, if you compute him into the average, on average, everyone in the bar is now a millionaire because 1 billionaire's walked in and skewed the average so much. What I'm getting at with this point is that if you say we all have to tighten our belts, we all have to be austere, well, that only makes sense if we're all wearing the same pants. And the one thing that we know is that over the past 30 years, those pants have become very, very unequally distributed. And when you start to do austerity, you're cutting government services. Who is it that consumes government services? Is it Bill Gates? Absolutely not. It's the average guy in the bar, and they're the ones that are going to pay for it. And the triple injustice of this is that you're bailing out bankers, basically with the savings and the benefits and the policies which are there for workers at the other end of the income distribution. And having bailed them, you're now going to make them unemployed, and then you're going to cut their services. That's a triple whammy, and it's triply unfair.
So it is, as you point out, just a case of the average consumer, the little guy, paying for the mistakes of the very rich?
Yeah, at base, that's basically it. Essentially, you go back to the Bush tax cuts. The Bush tax cuts were deliberately skewed up to the top part of the income distribution. The current capital gains was supposed to unleash a flood of entrepreneurship and innovation. None of that happened. All it did was blow a bigger deficit. Then you have 2 wars of choice on top of that, and then you bail out a financial sector, which means that the earnings of those people in the financial sector are back to where they were before the crisis, and they didn't have to pay for the mistake they made. Everyone else paid for it.
This seems pretty simple to me in this conversation that we're having today. Why can't it be simplified for the American public, for the Europeans, whoever it is? And I guess we shouldn't compare America to the European countries because there certainly are different economies. But why can't this message get through to the American public and therefore put pressure on Congress to do the right thing, if you will?
I think there's a couple of elements in play. The first one is simple politics. I mean, the Republicans now who are jumping up and down and screaming about the debt weren't doing so in 2006 before the financial crisis when they were campaigning for another round of tax cuts to make the deficit and the debt even bigger. So there's a real Johnny-come-lately story for these guys. There's the attraction of austerity as an idea is its simplicity. Look, we're spending too much, so you stop spending. What's the problem? Well, you got to take an extra step and say, what happens if everyone does that all at once? It becomes a disaster, and that's what's happening in Europe. And then the third part of it is there's a very strong streak in American politics, which has never trusted the state. And if you don't trust the state, and the argument is we're in a crisis, the state needs to spend more money, and people are saying more money, look at the size of the debt already, it's trillions of dollars. It's very hard to basically make people focus for a moment and say, okay, let's everyone sit down, calm down, and think about what we're saying here. It's not that difficult. It's not that hard to figure this one out. But to do that, you have to get beyond the partisan rhetoric, and unfortunately, we're incapable of doing that at this point.
We're speaking with Mark Blyth, professor of international political economy at Brown University, also the author of a new book called Austerity: The History of a Dangerous Idea. Now, you suggest that this financial crisis can end well only with higher taxes. So what kind of taxes and who pays them?
Well, it's not that it's going to end well. You've got to find a resolution for the debt problem. I'm not saying there isn't a debt problem. There's a lot of debt. We've been basically piling up debt for a decade, and the financial crisis really turbocharged that. Is it the huge problem that we need to deal with it now? No, because the United States is growing because it's not cutting. Europe is cutting and it's not growing. The best thing you can do for growth, the reduction of debt, is to grow rather than to cut. So where do taxes fit into this? At the end of the day, you get what you pay for. To go back to what I was saying earlier on, if you're spending 25 and you're taxing at 18, you're going to end up with a deficit that becomes a debt. We've got to close that gap. Now, how do we do this? Well, the tax code has become incredibly skewed over the past 30 years towards top earners. They're paying less taxes now than they were under Richard Nixon. At the height of American power and at the very zenith of the American middle class's political and economic clout, Eisenhower was president, and the top marginal rate of taxation was 91%. It was 87% with tax relief. So we're paying way less now, and people are screaming about it. They're paying, the rich already pay all the taxes. Well, that's because they got all the money. So first of all, that's going to have to change. But then there's a lot of pots of gold offshore. A wonderful line that I always think of in this one is something that Stalin once said to the Vatican representative. How many divisions does the Pope have? So here's my question. How many divisions do the Cayman Islands have? Or Jersey? Because there could be as much as $30 trillion in untaxed wealth hidden offshore. So we got a big debt problem. We can basically take money from our pensioners who have earned this through their savings through government programs, or we can turn around to the Cayman Islands or the Swiss or whoever and say, hand it over. That's what's going to happen.
Eye-opening conversation today. Mark Blyth, professor of international political economy at Brown University, author of the new book called Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Oh, anytime.
Thank you very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
The traffic clogging protest by truck drivers in the U.S. and Canada is about drivers being angry over COVID-19 vaccine mandates, right? No. That's the line being put out by right-wing extremists trying to use the legitimate gripes of truckers for their own political gain. The extremists are nuts, not the truckers. My Uncle Emmett was a highballing trucker in the 1960s when driving offered an honest job, decent pay, union protections, benefits, and normal hours. Then came the deregulation craze of the 1980s, pushed by corporate profiteers and right-wing ideologues who cast unions aside, crashed driver pay, and turned the job into a punishment. Pay today is so abysmal that most truckers have to drive dangerously long shifts of well over 60 hours a week, with many topping 100 hours to make a bare-bones living. It's a grind, too. You can't stand up for hours. You travel alone. Dinner is a gas station burrito. Bathroom breaks mean pulling out the plastic jug you carry along, and you won't get home for days. Exhaustion is a constant companion and a real hazard. Drivers call these big rigs 40 tons of death. Yet, corporate, political, and media elites, oblivious to all of the above, whine that America has a trucker shortage. Not so. There are plenty of licensed drivers. But get this, 9 out of 10 quit within a year of getting a job. That's not because of a vaccine mandate. It's because truckers are underpaid, overworked, endangered, and even dehumanized by bosses who install surveillance cameras, sensors, and other technology to record and report every twitch a driver makes. This is Jim Hightower saying, today's explosive truck driver protests are not a right-wing expression. It's a rebellion against the plutocratic system that the right wing has imposed on truckers and on America.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
And joining us now, Simon Johnson, former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management and co-author of White House Burning, The Founding Fathers, Our National Debt, and Why It Matters to You. Simon Johnson, thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure.
Now that the economy seems to have stabilized somewhat, many economists and politicians see that proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. Do you?
Well, certainly there's an economic recovery underway. It's slower than we would like it to be. The jobs have still not come back to anywhere near where they were in 2007 before the crisis began. But yes, the economy is improving.
All right, so the fiscal cliff negotiations, did they simply put off another day of reckoning that could threaten the stability of the American economy?
Well, there was some progress made at that point. Tax rates did go up on higher income people. That's what needed to happen. I think further adjustment in the revenue base is needed, and that's still on the table in Washington. We need to address our fiscal problems, but we mustn't panic about them. There's no need for precipitate, irresponsible austerity at this point.
Well, it seems that all of a sudden, so they do the temporary deal to keep us from falling off the cliff. And now it seems there are a lot of folks in Congress that are very complacent and almost seemingly willing to just let it happen, let sequestration happen. That can't be the right way to go, can it?
No, it's a very bad way to go. But I think you're right. I think the House Republicans have dug in pretty hard. They also don't want to make their own proposals for what to cut, because any proposal you make is going to be unpopular, because much of government spending is actually pretty sensible and well done. So I think that we're going to have the sequester. It's a bigger question whether we're going to have a government shutdown, because that decision comes shortly afterwards. And then, of course, the debt ceiling comes back as a decision that has to be made by May. So there's a series of fiscal confrontations coming our way from Washington.
Now, we're speaking with Simon Johnson. He is the co-author of White House Burning, The Founding Fathers, Our National Debt, and Why It Matters to You. You mentioned the debt crisis, Simon. Is it really a debt ceiling crisis? And if so, how seriously would a U.S. default affect the global economy?
Oh, yeah, U.S. default would be a catastrophe. And anyone who even mentions the possibility is being irresponsible and playing with fire. The good news is that the Republicans backed down on that front in January, and hopefully they'll take it off the table going forward, because that was just the height of irresponsibility.
They took it off the table, but we've made these little temporary deals, and we keep, as what's been popular to say, is kicking the can down the road. What has to happen? I mean, do the Republicans really have a leg to stand on? I mean, there is the 14th Amendment. We're not really allowed to default. So I don't understand why there's an argument here from the Republicans.
Well, you're getting into some very interesting and tricky constitutional questions. I tend to agree with you. I think if it came down to it and the matter was referred to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court would support the ability of the Treasury to pay out on existing debt and, in fact, existing obligations previously incurred. But that will be a huge degree of uncertainty, and just imagine the world markets waiting with bated breath for that decision to be handed down from the Supreme Court. You don't want to go there. You don't want to go anywhere near there. The risk of some sort of accident and change in perception of the United States from being a safe place to invest to being a crazy place. Mm-hmm. That's too much danger there.
What would be the effect on the private sector, both big corporations and small businesses? So let's kind of look at those separately in the event of a government shutdown.
Well, it's damaging and it's disruptive. It depends, of course, on exactly the nature of the shutdown, and there's various ways to handle that. But what business really needs at this point is greater certainty. They need to know where government spending is going to be. Need to know what kind of contracts are going to be fulfilled and what sort of conditions. The instability generated by these fiscal confrontations is not helpful to the recovery. Mm-hmm.
The economy, of course, represents a balance of many factors. Is employment the most important one at this point?
Employment is crucial, because employment is the basis not just for people's incomes and their livelihoods and their families, which of course is critical, but also the revenue base of the government. So when people show you a lot of times exaggerated numbers about fiscal deficits, those are exaggerated precisely because the employment is still below where it needs to be and where it will be. The economy will recover. The question is, how quickly can we get back there, and how much uncertainty will be generated by these fiscal confrontations in Washington?
The Simpson-Bowles Commission, we haven't been hearing a whole lot about it. Of course, the president came out initially and said, hey, this is a great idea, and seemingly kind of backed off of that. These seem like, and I think we have to understand that whatever happens here, everybody's going to have to give up a little, and everybody's going to get hurt a little bit by this, but it doesn't have to be as bad as sequestration, of course. So what about Simpson-Bowles and the work of that commission? Does some of that come back into play now, and maybe some of those cuts and some of those things, and then in turn, does that eventually create jobs?
Well, some of those cuts probably will come back into play. I think relative to those proposals, I would strongly recommend strengthening the revenue base of the federal government, not so much cutting some of the programs that are actually quite effective and a good use of public money. But we'll see exactly what proposals the administration puts forward and how the Republicans counter. I think that there is a danger, whatever happens, of some pretty damaging cutbacks in public sector investment, for example. But that does seem to be the mood in Washington at the moment.
And you hear all sorts of things that could come from sequestration, where even NOAA would be shutting down satellites and not on sunny days and not watching or hoping that there aren't any storms that crop up, and the FBI would be furloughed and things like that. I mean, it's almost they're playing with this like it's some sort of game on Capitol Hill.
Well, I think that there are some people who are trying to create the impression that we're a banana republic. That doesn't know how to manage its public affairs, and I hope they're wrong. I hope that's not how people look back on this. I hope that we come through it, but it is worrying. The degree of irresponsibility, the degree to which some parts of the political spectrum want to undermine the credibility of federal government, that is alarming.
We're speaking with Simon Johnson, former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and co-author of White House Burning: The Founding Fathers, Our National Debt, and Why It Matters to You. What role, rather, would true health care reform play in strengthening the economy? And is the Affordable Health Care Act, in fact, true health care reform?
Well, the Affordable Health Care Act is a step in the right direction, but it's only turns out to be a relatively small step. The longer-term fiscal issues that we face are largely about health care, not about Medicare or Medicaid per se, but much more broadly about health care spending and the rise in that spending relative to GDP. That's what we need to get a grip on, limit the size of that health care spending relative to the size of the economy. Shifting those costs out of the public sector, off Medicare, onto families, individuals, and companies, that's not any kind of solution. And we have to get beyond those proposals. I don't think healthcare is going to be solved and sorted out in the next decade or two, but I do think eventually we will get there.
So do you use the Affordable Health Care Act as then just your starting point to get that true healthcare reform?
Well, the Affordable Health Care Act is obviously going to be implemented, is being implemented, and yes, we will learn things from that, hopefully about better and worse ways to arrange healthcare, for example, at the state level. I think ultimately we move more towards a single-payer system with universal coverage, but obviously that statement is incredibly controversial right now, and nobody really wants to put that front and center of their electoral campaigns. So we're waiting to see. We're seeing what we can learn about controlling costs in healthcare, and this issue is not going to go away.
Okay. Simon Johnson, former chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Ronald A. Kurtz, professor of entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and co-author of White House Burning: The Founding Fathers, Our National Debt, and Why It Matters to You. Simon, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks very much.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Are you surprised that the war has dragged on this long and has become yet even more violent?
Well, more importantly, has the Kremlin been surprised? And I think that they have been caught very short. They, on the one hand, way underestimated the determination, the tenacity, the courage of the Ukrainians in resisting their invasion. And that's a surprise. I mean, Russia and Ukraine, they're right next door. They should have understood that. Had you asked anybody who knows Ukraine in the Washington think tank community, they would have said the Ukrainians will fight and they will fight hard. And the Kremlin also overestimated the capabilities of its military force. They made, or appeared that they wanted to make a quick grab for Kyiv, that they thought they could bag it in the first couple of days using relatively small units. They got repulsed. And what you've seen over the last 3 weeks is, as the Russian advances have been frustrated, particularly in the north and particularly around Kyiv, you have seen an escalation of indiscriminate use of artillery, and particularly in the tragic attacks that are now going on in Mariupol in the south.
It appears that they also bungled their supply lines, correct, in terms of food and fuel and basic
logistics
resources.
It's always been assumed that logistics are a weak point for the Russian military. They tend to be they get a lot of their logistics actually come from train or by rail. In fact, they actually have a rail force that's part of the military to do this. But they're having to supply their forces in Ukraine by truck. And although we see these maps that show Russia having occupied these large swatches of land in Ukraine, in fact, the Russians really just occupy roads. And in some cases, they can't secure the roads. So the Ukrainians are striking at those vulnerable supply lines, figuring that if you can knock out a supply convoy full of ammunition and fuel, you're going to stop the offensive. And that has led, I think, to some military experts now saying, this is a term I just learned, culmination, is that the Russians may be approaching this point of culmination, or simply they run out of the energy to sustain an organized offensive. And there are reports now that some Russian forces around Kyiv are actually digging in.
Well, Joe, what is your take? How has the Ukrainian military and civilian resistance been able to hold the Russians from gaining more ground?
It is a remarkable performance by the Ukrainian leadership and their military forces and their citizens. I heard one Ukrainian parliamentarian just the other day talk about how her friend was a teacher a week ago, and now he's carrying a Javelin missile. And it shows you and they're engaged in sending teams of 2, 3, 5 people, into the woods at night to attack the Russians while they're sleeping. So this is not what Putin thought he was going to encounter, and it is what classic military strategists would call the culmination point of his invasion. And what that means is when the culmination point is reached when an offensive force can no longer conduct operations, when it can no longer advance. So even though you're seeing the Russians pummel cities with artillery strikes, cruise missile strikes, ballistic missile strikes, their armored columns are no longer advancing. For example, that 40-mile-long column that we saw in the first and second week of the war on its way to Kyiv, it never reached Kyiv. It's still stuck about 15 miles outside the city. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry reported in their daily war bulletin, which I get in my email every morning, that there were no offensive military operations conducted by Russian forces yesterday, meaning advances, tanks moving, military forces advancing, etc., like that. And this is just stunning. Nobody really thought this was possible, or almost nobody thought it was possible. And it really is, as Steve has said, a sign of, one, the incredible weakness of the Russian military and the incredible bravery and smarts of the Ukrainians, who were now conducting counter-offensive operations, going after the Russians, in some cases pushing them back from cities that they had tried to surround, and freeing those cities once again from the attacks of the Russian forces.
But isn't the danger, Ambassador, of this, let's use the phrase, the culmination point, that the Russians will see that not as a reason for abandoning the effort or pulling back, but just the opposite of upping to the effort and using ever more aggressive weapons and tactics?
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the worries, is that as the Kremlin becomes even more frustrated, the inclination in the Kremlin may not be to seek a negotiated solution, a ceasefire, and then a solution that would provide for the withdrawal of Russian forces. But they may double down. And again, what I fear is, we've seen it in Mariupol now, but look at what the Russian military did in Syria. Bombing hospitals, bombing refugee centers. Look at what the Russian military did back in the Second Chechen War to Grozny, where they basically sat back and day and night pounded the city with artillery and short-range rockets until the city was flattened. And what I worry about is that the Russians begin to shift to that tactic. And the Russian calculation there might be that Zelensky will then want to save Ukrainian lives and will then start to compromise beyond what he's already offered. But I wonder if this may be just another one of the Kremlin's miscalculations in a long line of miscalculations over the last month. And that is, that could have the opposite effect, is even hardening the determination of the Ukrainians to resist. And this is one of those things, if you look at the numbers and the types of equipment, the Russians should be winning this war. But wars are not just about numbers and types of equipment. They're about determination and will. And the Russians don't seem to be very motivated when you look at the soldiers. And the Ukrainians are highly motivated. I think in part for many Ukrainians, this is an existential fight. If they lose this fight, they lose their democracy, and they lose what I believe is a vision that many young Ukrainians share, which is to become a normal European country. And that all goes out the window if the Russians prevail.
Yeah. Joe, how long do you think the Ukrainian military can hold on? And do they have the kind of weapons they need?
I think they have most of the kinds of weapons they need, but not in the quantities they need. And this is why you hear President Zelensky and others urging greater military assistance to Ukraine. And we have now convoys, trucks bringing this kind of equipment in. Another thing the Ukrainians report
like
is
what?
That,
like
what? Some of what they need is just the basic equipment, Kevlar vests, uniforms. They just uniforms, helmets, small arms, shotguns, rifles, things like that. And then you get to the more advanced infantry weapons still, like the Javelin anti-tank missile, the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, and also Russian-made equipment like that, the SA-7, SA-8, which have a longer range than the Stinger. And what they'd really would like is heavy equipment. And that gets a little complicated about the decision of whether you want to supply that, which might provoke a reaction from Putin. But that would be bigger anti-air equipment capable of shooting down fighters at long range, like the S-300 or even the S-400 anti-missile, anti-air system, and things that they could use for counter-artillery. That's what's really hurting them right now, is the artillery barrages and the multiple rocket launches that are coming into the cities, and the very, very accurate long-range cruise missile strikes that are coming in. Those are the things that are hitting the theaters, the shopping centers, those precision strikes, ammunition. Those are from basically from cruise missiles, and they could use things to suppress those. And that tends to be drones, would be very useful for them. And you see the U.S. is starting to supply some small drones called the Switchblade, which is capable of doing that kind of thing, flying many kilometers out and then dive bombing into the artillery that's attacking you. And they need more of those. And every indication is that the West, including the United States and its NATO allies, is willing and is now supplying them. So if those supplies continue, the Ukrainian forces could wage this fight for months.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and there are now something like 30 countries. It's not just NATO, but countries like Sweden, Finland, Japan. There are 30 countries now feeding defense assistance, and in many cases, lethal assistance, such as anti-armor and anti-air weapons, into the Ukrainians. This is becoming a global effort.
Right. It seems that the United States and these other nations are willing to do anything and give anything except what Zelensky asked for last week, which was a no-fly zone. Joe?
Well, there's a good reason for that.
A very good reason.
Yeah. And because, it's not like we're not in WandaVision where you cast a spell and you put a plexiglass dome around a magic force field around a city and therefore protect it. No, a no-fly zone is something you have to enforce. And the very first thing the U.S. military does with a no-fly zone is suppress enemy air defenses. That means we're going to go in and we're going to bomb Russian sites in Russia, right, that have these anti-air missiles. We're going to be killing Russians, killing Belarusians, and then also shooting down any planes that violate that no-fly zone. And that means also that U.S. fighters would be hit. U.S. air personnel would die. So that is a sustained conflict between U.S. and Russian forces, something that has not happened since the Bolshevik Revolution, when we set troops into Russia to aid the White Russians to try to stop that revolution. There were some skirmishes during the Korean War. There was a firefight a couple of years ago in Syria that killed a lot of Russian mercenaries, but nothing sustained. You do that, you have a sustained U.S.-Russian fight, well, that's going to escalate, and there's no telling where it would go. And that, as President Biden said, could be World War III. He's not kidding about that. I agree with that assessment, and that's why that is a firm line that he doesn't want to cross, and neither does NATO. The NATO allies are not keen to do this. I don't know of any who have just urged the U.S. to do this, even the Eastern European countries.
Yeah, Bill, Joe's exactly right. I'd add one additional point, which is if you look at particularly the civilian casualties being caused in Ukraine, some of that's coming from Russian airstrikes, but the large bulk of that is coming from artillery and mortars and tank rounds and short-range unguided rockets. And a no-fly zone wouldn't do anything to stop that. So you would run into the huge risk, which Joe's just described, and the gain's actually going to be relatively marginal in terms of the lives saved.
Steve, let me ask you, we haven't talked about, and I don't hear much anymore about sanctions, but the sanctions were the toughest maybe ever, right? Are they working? Are they having any impact at all?
Yeah, they are. I mean, you're already beginning to see lines developing in Russia for certain things. Sugar across Russia now, there's a rush now to find sugar. But I'll give you a couple of examples of what's happened. The ruble has lost, I think it's about 30 to 40% of its value since 2 months ago. The Russian stock exchange has not opened since the West announced the sanctions, because the expectation is that the stocks would just crash. I think I saw somewhere that said some Russian listed stocks on Western exchanges had lost 90% of their value. So what is happening now is it's beginning. It will take a little bit of time, but the expectation is that before too long, Russians are going to be facing double-digit inflation. I have seen expectations for the contraction of the Russian economy of anywhere from 7 to 15% this year. So there are going to be, I think, some very painful economic consequences for Russia. But it's also things that go beyond this. I mean, Boeing and Airbus have now stopped providing any spare parts to Russia. And there's probably about 600 Boeing and Airbus aircraft operating in Russia, including on Russian domestic flights. And I think I saw somewhere that all of the airworthiness certificates for those planes have now been suspended, because not only are they not getting spare parts, they're no longer getting the digital updates that they need for the computer systems on board the planes. So Aeroflot 2 weeks ago suspended all of its flights except to Belarus, even though Aeroflot is not banned from flying to places like in Asia and such like that. So there are going to be a lot of impacts. And you see it in one really interesting indicator, which is in the last 3 weeks, the estimate is between 200 and 300,000 Russians have left. They're going out via Georgia, Finland. They're going out via Armenia. I think it was either the New York Times or the Washington Post had an article talking about people from Russia transiting through Armenia. They can still get by air to Armenia, and they're planning on going to Europe or the United States, and most of them saying, we're not going back. And so Russia, and again, these will be consequences for years down the road, but the people who are leaving are the high-tech workers, the people with real skills, the people that Russia needs for a modern economy. The problem I think that Ukraine has is these impacts are going to be felt weeks, months down the road. And from the Ukrainian point of view, you'd like to have the impact felt right now. And that brings up one last question. The head of the Russian central bank, the Russian minister of finance, these are smart people. They know about economics. They understand international finance. They know just how bad the economic hit is going to be. The question is, do they have access to Putin? And if they do, are they actually telling them this is what's going to happen to your economy in the coming months?
Joe, what is your take on, do we know, I mean, look, President Macron has talked to Putin, Erdogan from Turkey has talked to him, the Prime Minister of Israel has met with him. I mean, do we know what Putin wants?
I think
or
we do.
What he's willing to accept. Go ahead.
That's.
Oh, okay.
Let me answer the first question.
Got it. Yeah.
I think it's very clear what he wanted in the beginning, and the way he talked and the speeches he'd been making, months before the invasion, was that he just wanted to erase Ukrainian national identity. He wanted to erase Ukraine as a nation. And he talked about Ukraine as being, part of Russia, and what we share a common identity, he said. Well, that's not what the Ukrainians think, but that's what he thought he could get. He could just move in quickly in a few days. And Steve and I talked about this on day 6 of the war, that by day 6, it was already clear that he was failing to reach his objective. And to put in place either a puppet regime that could align Ukraine to Russia, or to just directly annex it the way he's annexed Crimea and the way he wants to annex part of the Donbass region. That's what he wanted. So what might he settle for? I think that the terms of a possible diplomatic solution are pretty clear, and they're on the table, and that would include a neutrality of Ukraine not joining NATO, not joining the EU, and actually President Zelensky has indicated he could accept that. It would include recognizing Crimea as part of Russia and recognizing the Donbass region as either part of Russia or an independent republic. That causes real difficulty for the Ukrainians. I don't know if they're in any mood to give that, but to save the rest of their cities, that might be something that the Ukrainians could agree to. But the final element that what Putin wants is the one that I don't think any Ukrainian's going to agree to, which is the demilitarization of Ukraine. Giving up their arms. There isn't a chance in hell that the Ukrainians are going to lay down their arms at this point. So those are the frame of this, but I don't think Putin is ready for this. I speak to some of my colleagues on the left who seem to think that Biden holds the magic key to this, that Biden could, as one said to me, Biden could snap his fingers and we'd have a peace plan in place. That is not what's going on at all. Zelensky is ready to negotiate. He wants to meet Putin directly. The allies and the U.S. want a negotiated settlement. That's the only way we could see to end this war, because we think we're in a stalemate that's going to go on for months, possibly, on this, with neither side being able to militarily defeat the other. But it's Putin. Putin is the one who's not ready to do this yet. He's still holding out the hope that some further escalation, either further bombardment of cities, maybe the use of nuclear weapons. I think that's unlikely, but you can't rule it out. Perhaps use of terror weapons like chlorine gas could terrorize the population and further empty the cities, tilt the balance. Putin's still holding out for some miracle military solution to this. That's what's preventing a real discussion of that kind of compromise.
Yeah, I think Joe's right. The problem is, right at this point, the Kremlin is not prepared for a serious negotiation where they make some compromises. But even if they do, it's going to be, as Joe suggests, a hard discussion. Most Ukrainians, I think, probably understand they don't have the leverage to get Crimea back. Mm-hmm. But still, politically, it's going to be very hard for Zelensky to say, I accept that as Russian. There'll be a lot of negative blowback. But even on the neutrality question, and actually, I guess this is one point I would differ with Joe a bit on, I think the Ukrainians are prepared to say, yes, we will abandon our desire to join NATO. I don't think they're prepared to give up the desire to join the European Union.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
A week and a half ago, the European Union finally said, we recognize your membership perspective. But then on the neutrality has a really big question, because the Ukrainians say, what will be the guarantees for our neutrality? And how do they trust anything from Moscow? I mean, in 1994, as part of the deal in which the Ukraine gave up what was in the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances had the Russians saying, we commit to respect your sovereignty and your territorial integrity, and we commit not to use force against you. And of course, that's all happened. Mm-hmm. So there may be a request, and this may be a difficult issue for the West, is the Ukrainians may say, we want some kinds of security guarantees from the West if the Russians violate this. And I think that'll be difficult.
Well, I was just going to ask you that. In a sense, Steve or Joe, doesn't Zelensky have he's got a pretty strong hand here, right? I mean, in a sense, he does have a lot of leverage.
He doesn't have to win the war. He just has to not lose the war.
Yes. Right. But see, this is the difficult part, because not losing means, okay, you've blocked the physical advance of the armored thrusts. Right. Yes, you've done that. You have prevented them from surrounding Kyiv and other cities. So that means the supply lines are open, so things still get in, including food and basic humanitarian supplies that you need. But can you, and in some areas you push them back, but can you really expel them from your country? I don't think so. I don't think so. So what you're really counting on is a sort of a war of attrition where you're killing Russians more than they're killing you, and that you're breaking the combat capability of the force. The standard rule of thumb is if you can decimate 10% of an attacking force, a battalion or even a brigade, you can take it out of combat. Can you do that with the Russian force? Maybe, but still, it's very difficult to see how the Ukrainians can win this. So in the end, you got to either hope for a collapse of the Russian force, and that might be possible if this goes on for months and Putin loses the war at home, he loses the economic war, he loses the diplomatic war. The Russian troops could just vote with their feet and like they did in World War I and just leave the front lines. It's possible, but at what cost? By that point, you're going to have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians killed in these artillery barrages in the city. So that is For a country the size of Ukraine, so what, 44 million? Those were enormous losses to take, and the cities would be completely destroyed at this point. Very tough to see Ukraine holding out that long.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.